Before the Erie Canal made New York rich and famous, before America really knew how to dig a canal at all, a self-taught cabinet maker named Loamy Baldwin cut a 27-mile waterway across the hills of Massachusetts, entirely by hand, to join the Merrimack River to the sea at Boston. It opened in 1803, 14 years before the first shovel of dirt was turned on the Erie. And here's the part most people never learn. When New York was finally ready to build the Erie Canal, the men who would dig it came to Massachusetts first to walk the banks of this older, smaller canal and study how it had been done. The Erie gets all the glory. But the Middlesex Canal is the one that taught America how to dig. I have been reading the old reports of the Middlesex Canal and the histories of the men who surveyed and dug it, and as always I want to begin with the two names the record actually kept, because the men who clawed this ditch out of the ground with picks and oxen are mostly remembered only as a number in a ledger. The first name is Loamy Baldwin. He was born in 1745 in Woburn, Massachusetts, and he is one of those early Americans who seem to have taught themselves everything. He was apprenticed as a cabinet maker, a maker of fine furniture, which was his father's trade. But Baldwin was hungry to understand how the world worked, and as a young man he used to walk all the way from his home in North Woburn to Cambridge, alongside his boyhood neighbor Benjamin Thompson, who would later become the famous scientist Count Rumford, just to sit in on the natural philosophy lectures at Harvard. When the Revolution came, Baldwin led the Woburn militia out to fight at Lexington and Concord on the first day of the war. He rose to the rank of colonel, he crossed the icy Delaware River with George Washington, and he fought at the Battle of Trenton on Christmas night of 1776. He came home a war hero with no formal training in engineering whatsoever, and somehow this furniture-making colonel became the man who would build one of the first great canals in the country. If his name rings a faint bell for another reason, here it is. The Baldwin apple, once the most popular apple in New England, is named after him because he found it growing and spread it across the region. The man could survey a canal and graft an orchard. The second name is William Weston. Baldwin had courage and intelligence, but he had never built a canal, and neither had anyone else in America. So the company did the wise thing and sent for the most experienced canal engineer they could find, an Englishman named William Weston. Weston came from a country that had been building canals for decades, and he brought with him something America did not yet have, which was the precise knowledge of how to make water go exactly where you wanted it. He brought the instruments, he brought the methods, and he brought the hard-won understanding that a canal is really a problem of levels, of knowing to within inches how high every foot of ground stands above every other foot. These two men are our anchors. Baldwin, the self-taught colonel who ran the work on the ground for 9 years, Weston, the English master who came over and showed America how it was supposed to be done. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. To understand why anyone would spend 9 years and a fortune digging a ditch across Massachusetts, you have to understand how brutally hard it was to move anything heavy in America in the 1790s. There were no railroads because the railroad had not been invented yet. There were no real highways, only rough dirt roads that turned to deep mud in spring and froze into broken ruts in winter. To haul a load of timber, or a barrel of flour, or a block of stone from the rich farm country of the Merrimack Valley down to the markets and the wharves of Boston meant a slow, punishing journey by ox cart over those terrible roads, and the cost of the hauling could be worth more than the goods themselves. Whole regions were locked away from the sea by nothing more than bad roads. This was the great problem of the young United States, and everyone who thought about the country's future kept running into it. The new nation was enormous and rich in land, timber, grain, and stone, but it was held together by almost nothing. Goods that were cheap and plentiful 100 miles inland were scarce and dear at the coast, simply because there was no affordable way to move them. George Washington himself worried about it constantly, fearing the western settlements would drift away from the seaboard states for lack of any real connection between them. The answer that the age settled on, before railroads existed, was water. Dig canals, link the rivers, and you could stitch the country together and let its wealth flow to market. It was the great building idea of the era, and the Middlesex Canal was one of the very first serious attempts at it anywhere in America, a test of whether the young country could actually build such a thing at all. Water was the answer, because water is the easiest road there is. A single horse walking along a canal bank could tow a boat carrying many tons, a load that would have taken a long train of ox carts to move overland. If you could dig a canal from the Merrimack River down to Boston Harbor, you could open up the entire interior of the region to trade. The vision was bold and simple. The execution was anything but. Because a canal is not a river. A canal is a man-made channel of still water that has to hold its level across whatever country it crosses, climbing up over the high ground and stepping back down the other side through locks. Those great water staircases that lift and lower boats from one level to the next. To build one, you have to read the land itself with extraordinary precision, and that is exactly where the Middlesex Canal nearly died before it began. Here is the disaster that almost ended the whole thing, and it is the reason I want you to remember the name William Weston. When the project started, the company used American surveyors to figure out the lay of the land between the Merrimack and the sea. Those surveyors did their best, but they had neither the instruments nor the experience for work this exact, and they got it catastrophically wrong. Their survey was off by about 140 feet of elevation over a stretch of only 26 miles. They had the Concord River sitting lower than the Merrimack, when in truth, the Concord was some 30 feet higher. If the canal had been dug to that first survey, the water would not have flowed. The entire project was built on a measurement that was wrong by the height of a 10-story building. And then Weston arrived from England with a precise leveling instrument called a Y-level, walked the ground, and corrected it. He found the true heights, he set the real grade, and he turned a doomed plan into a buildable one. America did not yet have the tools or the trained eyes to read its own ground accurately. It took an Englishman and his level to show them how, and that lesson, more than any single mile of ditch, is what the Middlesex Canal taught the country. It is worth understanding what that leveling actually involved, because it is the quiet heart of all canal building. To make still water flow gently downhill the whole way without ever running backward, you have to know the exact height of the ground at every point along 27 miles, to within inches. Weston's Y-level was a precision telescope set perfectly horizontal, and by sighting through it to a marked rod held up ahead, a surveyor could read the exact rise or fall of the land, station by station, mile after mile. It is slow, painstaking work, and a single accumulated error can ruin everything, as the first American survey had proved. The canal also needed a steady supply of water to replace what leaked away and what every passing boat carried over the locks. And Baldwin solved that by feeding the high middle stretch of the canal from the Concord River up at North Billerica. To carry the canal across the Concord itself, his men built an ingenious floating towpath, a walkway resting on the water so the towing horses could cross the river alongside the boats. Every one of these was a problem no American had solved before, worked out from scratch on the banks of this one canal. Let me show you what they actually built. And join me at the boss tier while I do. For $4.99 a month, loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to the digging. With the levels finally right, the work began in earnest in 1794, and it went on for 9 years. 27 miles of canal had to be dug across the Massachusetts countryside, a channel about 30 feet wide at the surface, narrowing to about 20 feet at the bottom and only about 3 feet deep. That sounds modest until you remember that every foot of it was dug by hand. There were no steam shovels, no excavators, no machines of any kind. There were men with picks and shovels, there were oxen dragging dump carts, and there was time. They cut the channel out of the earth, they lined the locks with stone, and they faced one engineering problem after another with no precedent to lean on. To lift and lower the boats over the changing height of the land, they built 20 locks, each one about 80 feet long, a series of watertight stone chambers with gates at each end. If you have never watched a canal lock work, the idea is beautifully simple. A lock is a stone chamber just big enough to hold a boat, with a heavy gate at each end. A boat coming uphill floats into the chamber. The lower gate closes behind it, and water is let in from above until the level inside the chamber rises, lifting the boat with it, until it matches the higher stretch of canal ahead. Then the upper gate opens and the boat floats out, several feet higher than it entered, having climbed a watery stair. To go downhill, you run it in reverse, letting water out until the boat sinks to the lower level. The Middlesex Canal had 20 of these chambers, stepping the boats up and over the high ground and back down to the sea. Every gate and every stone, fitted by hand, every chamber holding back tons of water on mortar mixed with ash shipped from the Caribbean. It is one of the oldest tricks in engineering, going back to the canals of China and Europe, and in the 1790s Americans had to learn it from the beginning, lock by lock. To carry the canal across the rivers and streams that lay in its path, they built 8 aqueducts, which are bridges that carry water instead of a road. The largest of them carried the canal across the Shawshene River on a structure 188 feet long, lifting the boats some 30 feet above the river below. Picture that for a moment. A boat full of timber, floating across a river on a bridge made to hold a canal in 1790-something, built by men who had never seen such a thing done. Carrying a canal across a river is one of the strangest-looking feats in all of engineering, water flowing over water, and the Middlesex had to do it again and again. 8 times the channel met a stream or a river it could not simply cross at grade, and 8 times Baldwin's men built an aqueduct to carry the canal over the top, a watertight trough held up on piers, with the towpath running alongside so the horses could keep walking. The boats floated across these troughs high in the air, and the whole thing had to be tight enough to never lose its water and strong enough to hold the weight of a loaded barge, which is a great deal of weight, since water itself is heavy, and a boat full of granite heavier still. Every aqueduct was a small bridge built to a standard most ordinary bridges never have to meet, because if it leaked, the canal drained, and if it failed, the boats fell. They built 8 of them across the Massachusetts countryside, by hand, with no one in the country who had done it before to ask for help. They even had to solve the problem of the mortar. To make the locks hold water, you need a cement that will set hard underwater and never wash out. And in the 1790s, America did not produce any such thing. So Baldwin imported a special volcanic ash, a natural cement material, all the way from a Caribbean island, to mix the watertight mortar for his lock walls. Think about the reach of that. To dig a ditch across Massachusetts, they had to send a ship to the West Indies for the right kind of dirt. Almost nothing about this project could be bought ready-made in America. They had to invent it, import it, or learn it as they went. And the men who did the digging, the men who actually turned 27 miles of New England soil with their own arms over those 9 years, are almost entirely unknown to us. They were local Massachusetts men and immigrants, hired in gangs and paid by the day, and the company records that survive count them the way you would count tools, by the wage paid and the work done, not by name. The ledger gives most of them no name, only a number. We know the colonel who ran the work and the Englishman who set the levels. We do not know the name of a single man who stood in the mud and dug, and there were hundreds of them, year after year, in the heat and the cold. Every mile of that canal was somebody's whole summer, and we cannot tell you who. 9 years is a long time to dig a ditch, and it is worth sitting with what those 9 years were like. The work could only go on in the warmer months, because in the New England winter, the ground froze hard as iron, and the water in the half-finished channel turned to ice. So every autumn the work shut down, and every spring it started again, slowly, in the mud of the thaw. The men worked with black powder to blast through ledge rock where they met it, and blasting in those days was crude and dangerous, with no safe way to handle a charge that did not go off when it should. They dug in the heat and the insects of the Massachusetts summer and hauled the spoil away by the cartload. There was no machine anywhere on the project. There was the pick, the shovel, the wheelbarrow, the ox, the cart, and the man. And there were 27 miles of earth to move with them. It took 9 years, because 9 years is how long it takes to move that much ground that way. And the wonder is not that it was slow, but that it was ever done at all. Before I go on, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old engineering stories like this one unless enough people click. One click, and then come right back. When it was finally finished and the water was let in, the Middlesex Canal opened to traffic in 1803, and it transformed eastern Massachusetts. Boats up to about 75 feet long, towed by horses walking the bank, could now carry 15 to 30 tons of cargo at a time, from the Merrimack Valley down to Boston, gliding along at the slow, steady pace of a walking horse. It was not only freight. The canal also carried people. 2 passenger packet boats, named the George Washington and the Governor Sullivan, ran the line, one setting out from each end every morning, towed by a pair of horses along the towpath. A packet was a long, narrow boat with seats and a cabin. and riding one was the smoothest, most pleasant travel available in that part of the country, gliding silently through the woods and farmland at the pace of a walk, with none of the bone-rattling jolt of a stagecoach on a rutted road. People would take the packet just for the pleasure of it. For a few decades, the Middlesex Canal was not only the region's freight highway, but one of its small wonders, a place where you could step onto a boat in the countryside and step off hours later in the city, carried the whole way by a walking horse and a ribbon of still water that men had cut through the hills by hand. The freight boats, meanwhile, carried timber and firewood and lumber, farm produce and barreled goods, and they carried stone. Granite quarried up in the Chelmsford country came down the canal to build the growing city of Boston, and some of that New England granite went into the most famous monument in the region, the Great Obelisk on Bunker Hill. The canal that an old Revolutionary colonel had dug now floated the stone for the monument to the battle he had marched off to fight in. For a few decades, the Middlesex Canal was the great artery of the region, the fastest and cheapest way to move heavy goods between the interior and the sea, and it made the men who ran it proud. I should be honest about the money, though, because the Middlesex Canal is a strange case, an engineering triumph that was a financial disappointment. It had cost an enormous sum to build, more than $500,000, raised from stockholders who were charged assessment after assessment, around 100 of them over the years, every time the company needed more cash. Those investors had put their faith and their fortunes into the canal expecting it to pay, and for the first 16 years, it paid them nothing at all. The company did not pay its first dividend until 1819, long after the canal had opened. And in the end, the people who held their shares the whole way through put more money in than they ever got back. The canal moved a fortune in goods and never made a fortune for its owners. It was, you could say, too far ahead of its time and too soon overtaken by the next one. A magnificent thing that enriched the whole region far more than it ever enriched the men who paid for it. The president of the company, through its early struggle, was James Sullivan, a Massachusetts lawyer who went on to become governor of the state, and whose name still marks Sullivan Square at the Boston end of the line. One quick note. I turned the full story into a book, Everything the Records Gave Me. If you want it, the link is in the description. But the real legacy of the Middlesex Canal is not the granite it carried or the towns it enriched. Its real legacy is the men it taught. Because this little canal, dug across Massachusetts before anyone in America really knew how, became the school where the country learned the trade of canal building. The engineers and contractors who cut their teeth on the Middlesex carried what they had learned to bigger projects across the young nation. And when the state of New York set out in the years after 1810 to build the most ambitious public work in American history, the Erie Canal, 363 miles across the entire state, its planners came to Massachusetts to study the Middlesex first. In 1816, the men charged with building the Erie examined the older canal closely, its 20 locks and its 8 aqueducts and its costs, and they took its lessons north with them. The records of the Erie are blunt about it. The best artificial navigation in the United States, they wrote, was the Middlesex Canal in Massachusetts, and so 2 of the Erie commissioners, along with 2 of their engineers, went to examine it in order to obtain practical information on the subject. That is the canal builder's version of going to study the one master who has actually done the thing before you attempt it yourself at 10 times the scale. And the young men who learned the American canal trade in these years, men like Benjamin Wright, who had become the chief engineer of the Erie and is often called the father of American civil engineering, were part of a small fellowship of self-taught engineers all learning from the same handful of early projects, of which the Middlesex was the most important. The knowledge passed from the Middlesex to the Erie, and from the Erie it spread to every canal and then every railroad in the country, a chain of teaching that started in a Massachusetts ditch. The Middlesex Canal was, in a very real sense, a small working model of the Erie, built a generation earlier. The famous canal that opened the American West was built by men who had first learned their craft, directly or indirectly, on the banks of a quiet ditch in Massachusetts. The student became more famous than the school, the way it usually goes. And then, having taught America how to build canals, the Middlesex Canal was killed by the very thing that canals had made possible, which is industrial progress. In 1835, a railroad called the Boston and Lowell opened, running almost exactly the same route as the canal, between the same 2 points. And a railroad simply beat a canal at its own game. A train could haul a far heavier load in a little over an hour over a distance that took the canal boats most of a day. The canal that moved goods at the pace of a walking horse could not compete with a machine that moved them at the pace of a locomotive. Traffic drained away to the railroad, the tolls dwindled, and around 1851 the Middlesex Canal collected its last toll and fell still. The water went stagnant, the locks rotted, and over the years the channel was filled in and built over, until today you have to know exactly where to look to find the traces of it. A few stone lock walls, a length of overgrown ditch, a historical marker here and there. The first great canal of the region, the school that taught the Erie, mostly vanished back into the ground it had been cut from, and the Middlesex was only the first to fall. Within a few decades, the railroad would do to almost every canal in America exactly what the Boston and Lowell did to the Middlesex, running a faster, cheaper iron line beside the water and draining the traffic away. The Great Canal Age that the Middlesex had helped begin lasted barely 2 generations before the railroads ended it. But that does not diminish what the canals did in their time, and it does not erase what this one taught. The canal boats were slow and the railroads were fast, and the country needed both in their turn. And it learned how to build the second partly by first learning how to build the first. Every railroad surveyor who later set a level grade across a valley was using, whether he knew it or not, the same patient science of levels that William Weston had carried to a Massachusetts canal company in 1794. The two men ended their stories in very different ways. William Weston, the English engineer, went on advising canal after canal across America, the Schuylkill and the Potomac, and the inland navigations of New York, quietly seeding the whole first generation of American canal engineering with the knowledge he had brought from England before he returned home to die in his own country in 1833. He is barely remembered in America today, and yet it is hard to name a man who did more to teach the young country how to move water. Lomi Baldwin, the cabinet maker colonel, died in his hometown of Woburn in 1807, only a few years after his canal opened, having lived just long enough to see the thing finished and flowing. He never saw the Erie Canal, never knew that the men who built it would study his work, never knew that the trade he had taught himself out of necessity would help open a continent. He left behind a canal that is mostly gone, an apple that still bears his name, and a family of sons who became engineers in their own right and carried the work forward. One of those sons, also named Lomi Baldwin, became so accomplished that he is sometimes called the father of civil engineering in America in his own right, and he went on to build great granite dry docks for the United States Navy, including one we have looked at in another story. The trade the father taught himself in order to dig one canal became the family business and helped build the country. As for the canal itself, if you go looking for it today in the suburbs north of Boston, you can still find pieces of it. A stretch of watered ditch here, a mossy stone lock chamber there, the line of an old towpath running improbably between modern houses and roads. A dedicated society works to mark and preserve what is left, but most of the 27 miles is gone, filled and paved and forgotten, which is a strange fate for something that was once the proudest piece of engineering in New England. And the lesson stayed, even after the canal itself was gone. That is the part that matters. The Royal Gorge Bridge still stands, the Bunker Hill Monument still stands, the great brick lighthouses still stand, but the Middlesex Canal is mostly a line of grass and old stone now, and somehow it is no less important for that, because the most valuable thing it built was never the ditch, it was the knowledge. It was a generation of American engineers and diggers who learned on 27 miles of Massachusetts how to read the land, how to set a level, how to raise a lock and float a boat across a river, and who then took that knowledge and dug the canals that opened the American West. The Middlesex Canal worked itself out of a job and then disappeared, the way a good teacher is forgotten by students who go on to be more famous than the teacher ever was. Here is the thought I will leave you with, and you can tell me in the comments whether you think I have it right. We remember the Erie Canal as the Great American Canal, the one that made New York the Empire State and opened the path to the West, and it deserves the memory. But the Erie did not spring out of nowhere. It was built by men who had to learn the craft somewhere, and a great deal of that learning happened first on a smaller canal in Massachusetts, dug by a self-taught colonel and an English engineer, and hundreds of nameless men with picks and oxen, 14 years before New York turned a single shovel. The Erie Canal is the monument. The Middlesex Canal is the lesson. And I have come to think the lessons matter more than the monuments, because a monument only stands in one place, but a lesson can be carried anywhere, and these men carried this one all the way across a continent. There is one more thing I keep turning over. The men who dug this canal made a poor return on their money. The canal they dug was made obsolete within a single lifetime, and most of it has now vanished from the ground. By every ordinary measure of success, the Middlesex Canal failed. And yet without it, the Erie might have come later, or harder, or not at all. And the men who learned their craft on its banks would have had to learn it somewhere else, at greater cost. Some of the most important work any generation does looks like failure up close, and only reveals itself as foundation from far away. The diggers in that Massachusetts mud were not just cutting a ditch. They were teaching a country a trade, and the country went on to use it to build itself, long after the teachers themselves and the quiet canal they dug were gone. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.